The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves. And he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. This, that single word, is sometimes the entire post of some of my friends on Facebook. This is usually the sole commentary for an attached article or perhaps a picture. It's as though there is no better way to summarize something, or that an event or issue is just too complex to paraphrase. Just read this. Look at this. This tells you how I'm feeling, what my perspective is, or this simply gives you the context for everything we're going through right now. I thought about those posts as I read today's gospel reading, because our gospel reading also begins with this. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there and went to a deserted place. As with some of my friends on Facebook, Matthew has used this to sum up a whole series of events that now will set the context for what follows. This actually refers back to a long recitation in the previous chapter of how John the Baptist had been imprisoned by Herod Antipas. He had been there for a long time, and then finally beheaded in a cruel act of palace intrigue. Afterwards, his followers were allowed to come and retrieve his body. They took him, and they buried him. Finally, they came and found Jesus, and they told Jesus what had happened. Now, Matthew writes, when Jesus heard this, he left where he was, and he looked for a deserted place where he and his disciples could process the trauma that had just happened. This was a mess. John the Baptist had been an important person in bringing people closer to God. His murder impacted Jesus and his disciples, as well as thousands of others. Jesus was also under no illusion that if Herod was willing to go after somebody like John, Herod and others like him would soon be gunning for Jesus. Next to his own arrest and crucifixion, the beheading of John the Baptist was possibly the most stressful and traumatic moment of Jesus' ministry. This happened. And now Jesus and his disciples needed a break to process it all. So they got in the boat and they headed to a deserted place where they could pray and think and rest. And it's in the context of all of this that the feeding of the 5,000 occurs. Now sometimes we read this story and think that Jesus and his disciples were just happily going about their journey when they just happened to find this crowd of people and it was a nice, peaceful, happy moment. But at least as Matthew tells the story, this was perhaps the time when Jesus and his disciples most needed to get away and be alone. It was perhaps the most difficult and inconvenient moment to need to rise to the occasion. And knowing this makes what happened all the more remarkable. in spite of the fact that now was just not a good time, Jesus called his disciples to recognize an opportunity to do something really important, to make God's presence known in the lives of other people, in spite of all of this, which, he didn't have to do. Jesus looked up and he saw the crowds. He could have said, "Come on, guys, back in the boat, let's go someplace else." But he saw an important opportunity, and he called his disciples to see it too. In spite of the fact that now was just not a good time, Jesus called his disciples to look at what they had instead of what they lacked, which, is often difficult, especially in times of great loss and insecurity. I mean, that's the way the disciples begin the conversation, right? Jesus, we have nothing but except this 5 loaves and 2 fish. They look at what they don't have first. Jesus called them to look at what they did have. And in spite of the fact that this was just not a good time, Jesus called his disciples to act right here and right now, even and especially if the world seemed to be falling apart around them. They needed to do something to respond right here and right now, even if all of this had happened. I do not know whether the disciples really wanted to do any of these things, and maybe Jesus wasn't even all that excited about it. But they did it. And it had a huge impact on the lives of people who also probably felt that the world around them was falling apart. Many of these people also had probably by this point heard about the beheading of John the Baptist and all the other stuff that was happening. In fact, this one event had such an impact that this miracle that we call the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle of Jesus to be recorded in all 4 of our Gospels. This was it, people having lunch. I mean, you'd think it was raising somebody from the dead or something like that. Why was it this that gets remembered across all 4 Gospels? Maybe some of the impact came about because Jesus acted through his disciples in the midst of all of this. That is, in the middle of a time when everything seemed to be going wrong. Perhaps that was the time when people were most open to experiencing and recognizing God's active presence in their lives. As I said, this story appears in all 4 of our Gospels, and so we read it pretty much every year. And yet this year, the fact that Matthew tells us that this miracle occurred in the midst of all of this seems particularly important. After all, we too are in the midst of this. I mean, the pandemic, the economic crisis, the racial injustice, the political nastiness, all of this. The list just goes on. If I say, we're dealing with this, everybody knows what I'm talking about. And at times like this, it's natural for us too to long for a time when things are not like this. It's natural to want to look for a spiritual and physical place of rest and refreshment. It's natural to want to take a break and wait for a better time when we can really rally together and do great things for God. But maybe this is precisely the time Jesus most needs us to be his disciples. After all, this is the time when the world needs to experience God's presence, just as it was back when Jesus fed the 5,000. And so just as with his first disciples, this is also a time Jesus is calling us individually and collectively to be disciples who open our eyes to the opportunity God is giving us to make his presence a living reality in the lives of others. Sometimes part of being a disciple in this time is having a different perspective, being willing to open our eyes, to lift up our eyes, to see what's going on around us, and to say, hey, maybe I need to pay attention to this instead of just all of the other nonsense that's happening. Now, sometimes it means looking up instead of just down at my newsfeed. That's actually been a useful thing for my own sense of mental health as well, to be able to look around and say, what thing can I do today that makes a difference in my life and the life of my community, that would actually help or prepare for the future and do something good, instead of just constantly looking down and going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Maybe that perspective is part of what Jesus is calling us all to have. Jesus is also calling us, in the midst of all of this, individually and collectively, to be disciples who are particularly aware of the blessings that we do have to share, even and especially when they seem meager. You know, part of being a disciple in this time is sometimes just focusing on what we have and being willing, like those disciples, to share it, instead of just dwelling on what we've lost or what we might lose. You know, we read stories about how many people are out of work, how many people are food insecure. Oh my gosh, I feel like the person with the 5 loaves. How can I help so many people? But part of what Jesus maybe is calling us to do is to say, if you still have a job, if you still have the ability to have a few things to share those things with others. See what God can do with it. Make a difference with what you have, instead of just focusing on what you don't have. And part of what Jesus is calling us to do in order to be disciples in a time like this is to act boldly right now, instead of waiting to see if better times will arrive next week, next month, next year. I keep hoping that better times will arrive. But part of being a disciple in this time is about trusting God to be there for us right now, so that we're actually bold enough to give ourselves, instead of just waiting for a time when, I've got a template for how to deal with this. Part of my constant confusion, and maybe yours as well, is that there is no kind of template for when you're going through a situation like we're in right now, all of this. This is what you do, and this is how you act, and this is the schedule you follow. It's just not there. And sometimes that makes people just want to say, I'm going to sit back and wait. Martin Luther had a really famous saying that we used to put on t-shirts when we were in college that had big words that said, sin boldly. You may have seen that. That's only a piece of the quote, because in little tiny words underneath was the rest of the quote. He said, but believe in God more boldly still. And that was a saying he had whenever people were saying, I'm not sure what to do, I think I will sit back and do nothing. Luther said, you know what, God is calling you, Jesus is calling you right now to get up and do something. So even if you don't know that it's a perfect thing to do, go ahead and do it and trust God's love, trust God's help. Act in this moment, because now is the moment that God may actually most need you so that He can work through you. This is a tough and a stressful time that we're all going through. And it may be like this for a while, at least longer than most of us had hoped or imagined. But just as when Jesus fed the 5,000, this is also a time when Jesus is working in the life of the world. This is a time when Jesus most needs us to be courageous disciples. And that's because this is a moment when the world around us most needs to see and experience the presence of God working through us.